All right, I've got 6 o'clock, so welcome everybody.
Thanks.
I hope you have had a great week and it's going well for you. I want to tell you first before we get started, though, I really enjoyed the weekend. I know you probably didn't look forward to a weekend away from family and friends and you have so many different things going on, but I really enjoyed that, getting to know you all and enjoyed the interaction, so thank you for that opportunity. Our next weekend, I think, is sometime in October 21, 26, 27, the end of October. So it'll be close to Halloween, so we can do some trick-or-treating during our session. So be prepared for that. Now tell me what kind of trick-or-treat you get that weekend. All right, let's jump right into it because we kind of have a full night. Of course, we're done when we're done. Kristen hasn't joined us yet, have you, Kristen? Nope, not yet.
She just texted me. She's on her way. She should log in just a few minutes.
Okay. Well, then I'll say what I want to say about her. I had a chance to meet with her on Tuesday. She was on campus, and so I'll wait until she checks in so we can I'll let you all know what she did. Anyway, I enjoyed meeting you. We're going to go ahead and get started then. Want to bring you back to, of course, to Blackboard, to our shell. This is Blackboard 708. A couple of things you'll, of course, want to call your attention to on the discussion board. Remember, there are only 2 places where we have grades, so things to be graded. So if you look at discussion board, you'll see that week 3, there are 2 ethics questions. We are on week 4, and we did away with the ethics scenario for week 4. And this is where you are, right here is where you're going to download when you finally, as some of you already have, great, where you download your final policies for the review exercise on this past weekend. Once I get that, I will shoot back some suggestions to you. If I do that and you get a 50, just make some of the suggestions happen and then send it back to me. The ultimate goal is, of course, for it to be 100. So if I see something I want to make a suggestion, I'll do it here and I'll try to get you the information back. And if it's less than 100, again, the way I've got Blackboard set up, you can try it many, many different times. So it's unlimited opportunities.
Dr. Stone?
Yes.
You said just one person in the group has to upload it, or?
All of you need to do it.
Oh, all of us, okay.
Yes, because that way all of you will get the 100. And you don't want to miss the 100. So whoever is the keeper of that, whoever's got the final document, you probably need to email it to your colleagues and say, here it is, go ahead and upload it on discussion board. Because if not, I can only give 100 to the people who are listed. So
got it.
Everybody in your group, and this is open until the end of the semester, so make sure it's there.
Dr. Stone. Lakeisha, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, our final document's in the Google Doc that we created.
Okay, thanks.
And so
I've not made any changes to it.
All right, so then just download that on discussion board. Looking again at discussion board, the other thing to remember is down here, the drafts. This is just basically, even though it's graded, this is kind of the work we were doing on Saturday. And so it will be graded when I get a chance to look at some of those. So just
Dr. Stone?
Yes.
On scenario 10, it's week 3, scenario 10. There's at the end of it, it's got all these different things. You are. Do we have an assignment of which one we are? Do we pick one, or do we do one for each of those scenarios?
It says, I think it's.
You are way ahead of the game.
It's like you are a board member, you are the superintendent.
Yeah. Can you see it on the screen?
Yes.
Is it on the screen? Okay. You can pick whatever one you want.
Okay, thank you.
But in your description, tell me which one you're taking.
Okay.
So I'll have a perspective.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Glad you caught that. Where am I? All right. Any other questions on this before we leave discussion board? Somebody let me know when Kristen gets here. Course assessments, remind you there. A couple of things.
Kristen's here.
Hey, Kristen, glad you made it. I'll want to say something in a minute.
No.
Just want to remind you, we are, even though your syllabus says to go ahead and start working on Part A, Part B, and Part C. We're going to spend some time on this next week, the weekend sessions we have. So if you really want to concentrate on something else at this point, go ahead and do that, because I would really like to spend a little bit of time talking with you about Parts A, Parts B, Parts C. If you've already done it, super, but that's kind of one of the things I want to talk about at the next weekend session, because this is something that's going to make it into your final artifact. But if you're moving ahead, go right ahead, but don't fret if it's already not there. Your presentations, once you've made your presentation, each of you will have 3. Once you've made your presentation, just download it under Presentation 1, Presentation 2, Presentation 3. That, of course, receives a grade as well. Any questions on the shale for 708? Because I want to take you real quickly to 709. Oh, by the way, Kristen, welcome. On Zoom. All right. For all of you, I had the pleasure Tuesday of sitting in on Kristen's, what was that, your dissertation proposal, Kristen?
Yes, my defense.
Yes, for her proposal. And she met with, I'm not on her committee, but Steve Laws told me I might want to come. So I enjoyed it. She did a great job, certainly a model. So anyway, Kristen, you did a great job and moving in the great direction. And some of the comments from the committee after you left was that they really thought yours was a top quality project. So I want to hats off to you. I am now beginning to learn as a part of my induction into the university that I will be responsible for dissertation committees. I'll be responsible for being a member as well as as well as a responsibility to be the chair for some of them. So they're giving me a good chance to break in, and I'll have 2 or 3 more that I sit in to make sure that I understand exactly what you're doing. I wrote my dissertation in 1993, long, long time ago. The defense was probably the hardest thing I ever had to do because I had 3 people on my committee. The only one who even knew what I was talking about was my chairman, and he is the only one who even liked the project that I was working on. The other 2 were opposed to it and really had a lot of questions. And I have to say, to the benefit of my chairman, a lot of those questions I really couldn't answer because they were so in-depth. But he just jumped right in there and said, Steve, this is what, this is it. So your chairman is very important. So choose wisely when you get a chairman. You've got a great one, Kristen. So Kristen did a great job. I'm going to move to 709 because I want to remind you that this is here for you. It's an opportunity for, this is a shale for 709. It's the opportunity for you to begin to start putting stuff. So you be drawing it from 701, 703, 705, 707. A couple of things I've added over the week here that you need to see. This comes straight out of our manual from 2013, 2014, which is the most current one we have. We've got to rewrite it this weekend, but this is your whole dissertation process. I know by a show of hands, some of you are well into this, but because we don't have a new policy yet, you might want to study this one as you begin to talk about what you're going to do for your dissertation. This comes straight out of our handbook. It is old, but there's no plans to redo it anytime soon or not before many of you get started. So this will be the guiding principle that you have. So look at that. Also in 708, where am I? 709, excuse me. Down at the bottom, again, you have your dissertation warehouse. This is where you find great articles, great things. Kristen would, of course, want to load hers with some technology research. You'd want to put a couple of things in there about technology that she's doing her study on. Whatever you're doing yours on, if there's a great article and you don't want to keep hanging on to it, put it all in one place. All you got to do, did we decide you can do this, build content? You can't you? If not, I was supposed to put an empty folder in there. I'll go back and do that. Well, shoot. I can do that now. You. Let me go back. Whatever you want to put in there. All right. Also, in 709, there are some neat things from the library here that I thought you might want to have access to as you begin. Let's go back to the start. Some other things you might want to do, and this comes straight from the Gardner-Webb University Library. There's an article on common research guidelines, plagiarism guidelines, what is plagiarism, all of these really good stuff for you as you begin to write your dissertation. So I'll keep adding stuff, but whenever I add stuff, I'll let you know what it is. All right, I am going back to 708 unless you all have some questions. And I want to look at the schedule one more time as where we're going. This is week 3. Next week, of course, is week 4. Some of the activities, you begin reading Essex, and I promise you, you're going to like Essex a lot better than you like Fowler. It's going to be much, much better. Week 4 scenario. We got rid of that, didn't we? All right, it's gone. And then, of course, the presentations for next week, you see who they are. And if we don't get through some of them tonight, we'll add them to that as well. Looking ahead, the next week, and we will only have 6 weeks. You see this week down here, November 5 through 11. We are probably going to cancel that one where I will come on in Zoom, but you don't have to. I'll come on to answer any questions you have about catching up and doing some stuff. So that's probably going to be an optional one. I don't know why it's out of order here. No, it's not. Our next face-to-face, oh gosh. A couple of things were out of order. All right. Okay. All right. Let's now, is Lakeisha, are you ready to do your Fowler chapter 3?
Yes, sir.
All right, hang on. Let me turn it over to you. Let me go back to manage participants. Keisha. Now let me see if I remember how we do this.
You have to, I think, make me the host. Is that correct?
Yes. I'm still trying to remember how to do it though. Someone remember how to do this so the next time I can, let's see, usually.
I don't know about that part. Is it down at the bottom? At the top, you see a prompt icon.
I have a green rectangle at the bottom of my screen that says share screen. You have that, Lakeisha?
Yeah, I can. Yeah, but I think.
I have to do something.
I mean, I can try it that way. I think he has to do something, and then I do that.
Yeah.
If you can unshare your screen, Dr. Stone.
Pardon?
If you will unshare your screen, she should be able to share hers
Right.
on top of it. But 2 people can't share at the same time.
Right.
Okay, so I need to unshare.
Yeah, I think that's easier than giving someone host. Like
Yeah.
a host.
How do I unshare? Oh, up here?
That's a good question.
Do you just click on the green box again, maybe? I don't know.
All right, let's see. The green box. Oh, the red box says stop share. Hey.
Yeah.
All right. Now let me see, because there is a way to do this. Manage participants.
I can do it now.
Share now.
I can do it now.
Okay, go ahead.
All right, so this is Policy Studies for Educational Leaders, 4th edition, Chapter 3. the economy and demographics. Why analyze the policy environment? Hold on one second. I need to get this out of here. All right, good. So what is policy environment? The complex social dimensions of a specific place at a particular time constitutes its policy environment. Policy and its social environment, what we have to realize is that unlike Athena, Fowler gave this like metaphor, unlike Athena, the Greek god that emerged from Zeus due to a bad headache, policies don't just emerge from out of nowhere. So there are shifts in policies and they are not fully predictable. However, people who are knowledgeable about policy environment are usually not taken by surprise. So reasons for understanding policy environment. It's important to be aware of changes that may cause you to modify your plans. It helps school leaders to avoid wasting time, energy, and resources. It also helps school leaders to conceptualize the broad direction of education policy. It helps to interpret the flow of policy change and builds confidence in your own abilities to act constructively as public leaders in a changing world. So I kind of think about it as like if you start building a school and a school leader start building a school and they're not aware of the policy that affects building a school, then they may have wasted a lot of time and energy and resources into that because the policy may state that it may have changed and said they'll no longer be funded. So then it's like, oh my goodness, so it can really leave a person or a leader or a district hanging.
Before we move on,
sorry.
anyone
Yes.
think of a time? Excuse, can I interject?
Yes.
Okay. Can anyone think of a time when something unpredictable like that happened in your school system where it looked like the policy, everything was going well, the policy was going this way, and there was a big change at the last minute? When do those things usually happen? Can you think of an example in your district? I can think of probably the best example that you'll find at some point. Think of it this way. I'm sorry, I keep cutting somebody off. I'll hush.
Now you go ahead.
All right, I'm gonna talk. All right, think of it this way. What happened? How many of you have lived through a new superintendent coming in?
Yes.
I have.
Okay. Now, from a perspective of if you're an established principal, you're already established central office, or you're an established position, is that an easy transition? I mean, is that what are some of the things that because of course I've been on the other side, but what are some of the things that go through your mind when a new superintendent comes on board, particularly relative to your area of expertise or you?
One thing that comes to my mind is if they're going to move principals around.
What's their policy on moving or reassigning principals? Because I'll tell you, you know what? Many of my colleagues will do that simply because it's a show of I can do it. Does it make a lot of sense sometimes to move principals around? Not really. If you're being successful in your school and you haven't requested a move, why would I move you way across town and make you start over and make someone start over in a school that's working? What else would you think with a new superintendent?
I know when I first started, when Dr. Emery first came on, she changed the policy that related to how assistant principals can move up to become a principal, and that was the real big thing. So it became a pool now. It's assistant principal pool, and then within the pool, it has 3 different tiers. So if you're on a tier 3, then you'll be looked at as being in the pool to be a principal.
Like you're right up there at the next step, right?
Well, I'm actually,
No, I'm tier 3. You're ready for the principalship, right?
Right. Well, right now I'm not an assistant principal at all. I'm pretty much like on the principal level because I'm through central office now. So yeah,
all
it's
right.
kind of like that. Yeah.
Some other examples, because I want to kind of, because we need to give some examples of how policy changes, and it's very unpredictable.
Yeah.
Anything else that happens when a new superintendent comes in? It may be as simple as a new assistant principal comes in who knows technology or something.
Sometimes when a new a superintendent comes in, there's reorganization within the central office itself.
Absolutely.
Yep.
Just different expectations overall, like instructional expectations, leadership's expectations of what the principal leadership role really looks like might be different from a superintendent to superintendent.
One
You
thing
know-
that I'm sorry, did I interrupt you, Dr. Stone?
No, you go right ahead. I talk too much.
One thing that I'm always interested in, whether it's a superintendent or principal or even a director, somewhat depends on the size of your district, but what district initiatives are they going to bring to the table that they want implemented that may or may not fit into historically what's being done currently?
Yeah, that's a good point.
That is a good point.
Yeah, it's like the strategic plan of the district changes as well at times with the new superintendent.
One of the other big things too, and I know you all have moved beyond the AP level, but is the philosophy of assistant principals. You know, when I came to Caldwell County, we have assistant principals who consider that a career. They want to be the assistant principal for the rest of their life. And to me, that's a wasted space you're taking because I want to be training principals. So that was a big difference for us in Caldwell. And that's something that a change in policy, because traditionally, before I got there, the assistant principal was a career. And I'm not really seeing it as a career. I see either you're planning on moving on up, or you're just holding up a spot of someone who could be trained to be a principal. So, no, I don't like that holding spot. So that's some examples, and you have plenty others, but probably the most traumatic time for a school district is when there is a new superintendent, unknown. It's not the assistant superintendent who moves across the hall to become the superintendent. It really is an unknown quantity, someone that's unknown to the district. And that's why when they name a new superintendent in your district, you know, probably the first thing most people in the district do, or administrators, is go and try to make contacts with somebody in the district they came from and say, ooh, what's he like? What's she like? The other thing that they do too is that the other big change might be when you have a shakeup in the board, when the composition of the board changes, because that may be more dramatic sometimes than the changing of the superintendent. So back to your point, Ms. Hill, is that it is policies can change from very unpredictable sources. So go right ahead.
Okay. So now we're on the section of the economic environment. So the importance of the United States economy is also very important as to how we view policy. It has a huge impact on it. So when we look at our history of that, we look at the emergence of capitalism, the New Deal and its aftermath, Reaganomics, the Bushes and the Clintons. But then what really, really impacted us, and we're still being impacted right now, is the Great Recession. Well, it was called the Great Recession because, like the Great Depression, it was the longest. It lasted the longest. There is a table in the book that shows you how long each, recession lasted and that type of thing. So I think the Great Recession, it lasted about 18 years, I believe, but it was the longest, and it's usually the most severe. And so in 2010, I'm sorry, I was thinking about the depression, I think. But anyway, in 2010, in a 2010 report, researchers at the Pew Center on the states predicted that the Great Recession would affect school funding for years to come, saying it would take years for states to return to normal and whatever the new normal will be. So I think we can all concur that we're trying to get to that new normal because it keeps changing.
Yes.
And because of that Great Recession.
All right, can I add?
Sure.
All right, the recession in North Carolina really started in 2008. We were a little slower than the country. We have not recovered yet. And I know Frida is going to be doing at some point a PowerPoint for us about economic of the effect of funding for public schools since 2008. But I can tell you now, just if you have been in education since 2008, you know that where we were going in 2008, where we are now, we are still behind.
Yeah, we are.
North Carolina has come out of this recession, or coming out. Public education is way, way behind if it had been compared to what it was in 2008. It had been a normal growth. So we are not out of the Great Recession. And the sad truth of it is, North Carolina may be out of it, but they have not taken its public education systems out of the Great Recession. The budgets you have at your school systems are really they are, compared dollar to dollar from 2008, they're less than they were.
Yeah.
Isn't that right, Frida?
Yes.
And I meant to say 18 months and not 18 years for the Great Recession.
Yes.
It lasted 18 months. I said years. I was like, oh my God. But anyway, I'm glad it feels like 18 years. But anyway, the demographics and the policy environment. And I'm really kind of chunking this, Dr. Stone, because I know we have a lot of people, okay?
That's all right.
So there are a set of questions for analyzing a demographic environment. So which of these is rising, falling, remaining stable out of these questions? So you have, I'm not going to read all of them, but like the percentage of low-income families, what is happening in rural, urban, and suburban populations, what's happening to family composition, what's the percentage of people between ages 5 and 18, people over 50. And I remember being an assistant principal once with, I think it's 3 days ago, our operations officer, Daryl Walker.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, so he would be the one who would give these particular projections, and based on those projections, that will tell them how many schools that we need to start building in our district, how many, and then what's the capacity at each and that type of thing. So they put that stuff out there early so that we can know, okay, it's gonna probably be a vote coming along for a bond referendum, and so yeah, and that's all go through policy and stuff. So then our schools are coming up, and we have more schools coming. So, but it all depends on the demographic environment.
All right. Lakeisha, I am the world's worst, so you guys will understand when you're doing your PowerPoints. I just love to interject, and I hope that's not a problem for you.
You're fine. You're fine.
You remember probably the second week of class, or the second Zoom session, we had Dr. Johnson's demographics. The gray, the silvering, all those, all of this right into it. So, the reason why all these are important to policy is people older than 50 don't have children in school, so they don't care as much about public schools.
Right.
The percentage of kids 5 to 15, that's new schools you need to build. High income, that may be a factor in the private school effect. Low income, that's going to impact the number of kids who come to your school.
That's right.
ESL, all of these have something to do with policy. So that's why you need to keep up with the demographics. And that's why I think I put that in one of your charts to keep up with. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. That's okay. All right. So implications for education policy. I'm sorry, I'm going along in my book too. All right. So 10 questions to help in reading between the lines of educational policy. Okay. So what are the financial implications for this policy? Will it cost the same as, more than, or less than alternative policies? Will anyone gain financially from the policy? If so, who? Will anyone lose financially because of this policy? If so, who? Will this policy shift costs as measured in money, material, time from government to parents, teachers, administrators, or others? And we're going to talk a little bit more about these types of things too in chapter 11 when I present. Will this policy shift costs from one level of government to another? Could this policy be used to cut costs in ways not intended by its advocates? How will this policy affect the affluent? It's like you were saying, the affluent, the middle class, and the poor. Will this policy encourage more diversity, less diversity, or leave the current degree of diversity unchanged and consider racial, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and social class diversity as well as handicapping conditions? And then, will this policy support family life? If so, how? If not, why not?
Excellent questions.
Yeah. And then that's pretty much it. I just did like just a brief overview of chapter 3. And
any questions? All right, go ahead and after tonight, in case there's any questions or comments that you want to add to it, anybody have any questions or comments about chapter 3, which is economics and demographics, because they make a difference.
Oh yeah.
They will certainly establish policy. Good job.
Thank you.
You had 2 to do tonight, so we'll come back to you a little bit later on.
Yeah.
All right. Any questions? All right. Pam, you are up with chapter 4. How do I've already forgotten. How do you take charge?
Let me see if I can share my screen.
How did you do it, Lakeisha? Oh.
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I think we're good to go. There we go. So with mine was the political system and political culture. We covered part of this on Saturday when we were in class, but
well, that's not fair.
We did. We just talked about some of it. Maybe not in as much detail, but one of the things that this chapter starts out talking about is a little bit about more things that are maybe not so obvious. So the focus questions that it started out was basically the characteristics of a political system. How can leaders work most effective within the system? And then what is political culture? Why should leaders take into account the political culture of the geographic area in which they work? And I don't know how many of you actually knew which geographic area that you worked in. I wasn't aware of it, but there is a table that's on page 82 that you can refer to if you want to go ahead and look and see where our state is, and then what other states are associated with it. As we get into it, that might be a good.
Oh, we've got to talk about that too when we get to it.
Okay.
I'm just dying to talk about that.
Starting with some of the things that are a little bit less than obvious. In the very beginning, there's a definition of what the political culture is, and it talks about as a particular pattern of orientation in which the political system is embedded. It was defined in 3 basic political cultures as far as in the United States, with individualistic, moralistic, and traditionalistic. It went on to talk a little bit about that means that a school leader that moved from one state to another state, that it was very important that educator know or the school leader know what was really important to them, and then how they were defined as far as their political culture, because things that would have been important maybe in one area or one state would no longer be important in another one. It defined what federalism was. The best way it defined it was to contrast it with unitary government, one major political structure. Under a unitary system, it talked about how that France, Japan, and the United Kingdom were only one government in which the country exercised sovereign power by taking such actions, passing law, levying taxes, and that unitary governments also exist, though, in the United States. And they gave the example of the relationship between the 50 state governments and their respective local governments. It also did a little bit of contrasting as well under the federal system, as it talked about how several governments share sovereign powers among themselves, and the national government cannot abolish subsidiary governments.
Hey, Pam, are you keeping up with the PowerPoint or?
No, I did not. Thank you very much. I'm sorry about that.
That's all right.
You. And then it went on to say that the federal government does not have the authority to overrule the state governments when they are acting within their area. nor can they abolish them. Going back to what Lakeisha was saying earlier and talking about the Depression, it continues to talk about the history of federalism, and it says because of some of the, like the Great Depression, World War II, and so on, those economic problems were of such magnitude that the state and local governments were unable to address them effectively, and then that caused the federal government to step in, and they began to assume a more enhanced role in their economic and labor policy. And then as it continues and moves on in today, probably one of the most current ones that we can talk about that we all are familiar with is how No Child Left Behind came into the picture. This book actually started talking about like what would be some of the ramifications of No Child Left Behind, and then how it would go in, how it would be played out in the future. But as far as us, we're already aware of some of the things that actually happened. It talked about how that federalism today, which again, I think the first edition or the first writing of this book wasn't it in like 1997 or something like that, because this starts talking about in 82 how President Reagan had called for a new federalism, which involved giving states back more power in several areas. Because education was a major function of the state government, new federalism had a great impact on the education policy.
Yeah, one of the things that Ronald Reagan did was he wanted the federal government to get out of public education. Now, he really didn't want it to get out of public education because he thought that the states could do it better. He just thought he could do it cheaper.
Right.
So instead of the federal government having money for this specific program, this one, like all the titles that we're used to, they've now been reduced. The federal government just sent block grants to the states. And so that money went to North Carolina. And the reason why they did that was they could send, like, if you added all those funds they sent prior to this, if it was 50 million, if you send one big block grant, it was 35 million. So go figure. The federal government getting out of public education. He almost came close to abolishing the Department of Education. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. And that goes back to where I was with the overall effect of new federalism was to reduce the relative importance of the federal government in educational policy making, while increasing the relative importance of the states. Historically, it talked about how that state delegates, that much of their authority over education policy, or had delegated much of that to local school districts. And then it went back to talking about since like 1980 that the traditional allocation of power had shifted primarily because the local government is often in crisis. And
Yes.
Going back even to what you said earlier about we've not recovered from 2008, that's still true now. There also talked about when one government gives resources to another, it also expects to have some say about and how that those resources or funds are used. And then as a result, state governments are playing a more effective role than ever in spelling out how the districts should educate their students. And I think that's true with us as well. Okay. As far as separation of powers, our U.S. government is based on separation of powers rather than just on a structure of one government. And that was set in place by our founding fathers. The states were free to adopt any form of republic, a Republican government they pleased. All 50 states chose, though, to write a separate constitution. And they also chose to extend those three branches. And that's what we were talking about on Saturday when you pointed that out and wrote that up there on the board. So that brings us to our fragmentation of governance. Most U.S. school districts are special districts in which They are governed by an elected school board. Then we also have some other types of special districts. And they talked about those because I guess we've been talking a lot about education. This chapter also talked about like what are some other roles as far as the politics itself. And it talked about like parks districts, water districts, and so on. But the relevance of that comes out a little bit later as it goes ahead and it continues to talk about how that you're actually going to always be in competition and you need to know who your competitors are for your funds.
Very good point.
As a result, the school leaders must deal not only with the different branches of government, but also with the local governments whose geographic boards may overlap those of the school district and whose officials may perceive the school district as a competitor rather than an ally. And it shared that 92% of the U.S. school districts are independent. So they operate separately than any of the other local governments there.
Do you know what that really means, that 92%?
Well, it talked about how that
There's
way
one-
they could control their own. I think this is what I got out of it, that if they were operating independently, then they had more control over what was being said, and they also wanted to have educators as part of that board.
All right, that's
Is that-
true. But there's one big thing that those 92% districts do that North Carolina districts don't do that makes them less dependent on the local government. What is that? What is it the superintendent has to do to go every time to ask for from the county government?
He has to go and propose and put forth the budget and then ask for those funds.
And you know why? Because school boards in North Carolina can't tax. We can't raise money that way. We can't have a special tax for Elkin City schools. We can't have, well, I guess the city could do something, but we can't have a special tax for Wilkes County, because the school board, because we have no taxing authority. That means we can't borrow money. That's why whenever we build a building, we have to get the county commissioners to borrow the money for us. So that's what it means by that 92%. That 8%, which all of North Carolina school districts are in, do not have the taxing authority to raise money. So that means we are not independent. We are dependent upon the local government.
And it listed the other 5 states. It listed Alaska, Hawaii, Maryland, North Carolina, and Virginia.
Yep.
And I was trying to see if there's anything else on that point. I think that's really it of what I had. What I had down there. And then the chapter went on to talk about focus on elections. The characteristic of our political system and its focus on election rather than on governing. So it talked about like that you needed to always know and make certain that you were aware of who was actually like the terms for all the elections that were coming up, who was always going to be running. It talked about how that when a change was going to be made, you needed to be aware of how long that person was going to be in office, because if it was a 6-year term, that change would come at the beginning of that 6 years. If it's someone that's in a 2-year term, that they might not be as willing to step out of comfort zone or whatever, because they would feel like that they were constantly going to be running for election during that time. And then there was the part about the judicial review. That characteristic was that the courts have power of judicial review, meaning that they could declare legislation unconstitutional.
Yep.
Frequently, and this is another point, was that the legislators are more willing to let the judges be someone who makes an unpopular decision than them themselves actually making that decision. So it almost, again, would ensure that they could possibly be elected again.
Right. Here's a spoiler alert for everybody. On page 77, I'm going to ask you at some point, probably our 3rd session when we start talking about advocacy, to fill out page 77. So you might want to make a copy of it and put it into a document for you, because We'll talk about that later on. Page 77, Fowler. Go ahead.
Okay.
If I'm slowing you down, just tell me to be quiet.
No, you're fine. You're fine. Okay. As far as the competition among the governing bodies, they are usually primarily competing for two things. It's either going to be resources or power. Most of the time, it's probably going to be the resources. Also, in looking at, again, I mentioned earlier the competitors, so I'm not going to mention that again. And then the other thing that it talked about was making certain that you develop those friendly relationships. I thought that was kind of unique and funny, just to think about that for a moment, because I don't see as many people going out like playing golf on a golf course in our area as probably what you would, but it talked about developing those friendly relationships. It gave the example of the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary, and Rotary Club, the Rotary Club, and some other things. So, as you know, I was trying to relate that to some of the things that we had. I think in years past, you would have probably seen more people going out on the golf course to. They were actually just building those political relationships. It also went into talking about, like, if you had a policy that you were actually wanting to have passed, that it might go through multiple stages, and we talked about that on Saturday as well. It said for a proposal to be introduced several times, it's not unusual. And then also that there are lots and lots of bills that are introduced, but they never become law. It went on to talk about some of the timing policy and concerns with the election. Given the tendency of the U.S. political system to focus on elections, school leaders must closely be attuned to the electoral cycle, and that's what I was referencing earlier. In states with term limits, knowing how many years a politician has to serve is also very essential. And that brought us over to page 77. That's where Dr. Stone was a second ago.
Yeah, go ahead and fix that out because we're going to have it.
Okay. I'm trying to see. I think I've touched on some of that.
You have.
And I also touched on the windows of opportunity. That's on page 78 there, because that's what I was talking about earlier. You've got to know basically the terms will determine when you will have that opportunity. It's sort of like you hang on to it in your back pocket until that there's a time that's appropriate for you to introduce what your thought might be. It's funny, you know, I think about that sometimes, even when a principal's move, and Delana, she knows what I'm talking about there. But it's funny because sometimes when we have a big change, even at a school level, the teachers may have a big shuffle coming right before then a new principal comes in. We were talking about networking. There's also arenas that it talked about, and making certain that we made ourselves available to know what was going on currently in education, so that we could be able to possibly present our ideas, discuss our ideas, and also debate some of the things that are currently in education. And then it talked about, at a certain point in here, the different levels that you could actually be up on. Like if you were presenting and debating some of the policies, that you were definitely a leader outside of just your normal area. On page 80 is where it referenced the part about the golfing, which I thought was funny. It does talk about roundtables, and I think that we're a lot different with that now, because sometimes our roundtables may be a Zoom meeting just like this. It may
Pam,
be.
one of the other things is that it doesn't always happen on the golf cart. Sometimes some very high-level policy decisions are made in the men's bathroom. When people are away from, and I don't mean that in any other way other than it's secluded. It's a place where they can talk and they're out of the public view and they're out of the public ear. And so it is not uncommon for a lot of those high-powered conversations about policy and direction to be held in a private area like that, where sometimes it's so that the women on the team can't hear it or can't be a part of it. Sometimes it's just because they want to keep the public or, the executive bathroom where the public can't go. So something else. It's not always at the clubs. It's wherever there's a convenient place to have these conversations. And that's a part of the glass ceiling when the decisions are made in the men's bathroom. Go ahead.
That's like for us in Wilkes, I know that's one of the things they used to talk about is when we went to the 162-day calendar. Part of that was actually discussed totally outside of school because they kept trying to go back and think about how, and that was the time that we actually needed to cut back on our expenditures. So they looked at, how would that work? But that took a lot of minds and bodies, and like you said, it wasn't something that was just done sitting around in a room going over another meeting.
Rarely is.
Going back to political culture, sometimes probably one of the basic definitions of that is just the way that we do things around here. It's a collective way that people really think about some of the things and about policies, including beliefs about the political process and how it should be handled in an area. The political culture is not the same as a political system, which consists of a set of formal structures and constitutional laws. So it's something almost like it's like the unspoken. It's just the way that we do things. So you're expected sometimes to know that. There are 3 types of those cultures that we're going to look at. One was traditionalistic, and it says that it was dominant in the South and in regions of the country where the Southerners originally settled. If you will look at the traditionalistic states, though, there are a few that you might maybe not particularly think that might be involved in that, because if you're just thinking of the southern states, but I mean, it went all the way across to Oklahoma was listed there. West Virginia is also listed there. So, I was thinking to begin with, where is North Carolina? That is where North Carolina ended up.
You know what I noticed about the list?
What's that?
In the political culture, these are probably the red states. When in the common political culture, these are the red states. Go right ahead. The good old boy states.
The second major characteristic is a belief that the elite should provide political leadership. The elite can vary. It may consist of, and that goes back to your point of the good old boys in one place of a group of highly educated membership. In the traditionalistic political cultures, government is also seen as a positive force in society as long as it restricts its activity to maintaining the status quo. Okay. The participation in politics is considered a privilege, and it should be only restricted to the elite. Kinship, social connections, and personal relationships are extremely important. In this culture, politicians are expected to have a steadily maintain a wide-ranging networking of personal relationships. It does have an opportunity with trying to make certain that it's providing the needed balance in a rapid change in society. It also has major weaknesses. Its resistance to change has been a major factor in perpetuating racism and elitism and discouraging widespread political participation, including high voter turnout. So that's really on the traditionalist side. And if you look at the moralistic side, if you look at some of those states going down through there, and let's just see if those actually pertain, if you look at the states, to what you would think the definition of the moralistic political culture is. First of all, these members believe politics is or should be one of the greatest activities of man in his search for a good society and a public service. It's also believed that that politics should be as widespread as possible. New England town meeting is typical of the participative institutions this culture tends to produce. Unlike representative of the other two cultures, members of this moralistic culture view government, bureaucracies, and civil service systems positively because they believe that they encourage the fair, impartial implementation of government policies. Their belief is widespread and has also had a positive impact on the United States. And then if you look at the individualistic, some of those, I look at that and I see some of the northern states there, northeastern states, and then I go and see states such as Alaska and Hawaii out there by themselves. For the individualistic, it says that it is understood as a type of marketplace in which the government should serve utilitarian, primarily economic purposes. They believe that the government should keep to a strict minimum its intervention in private spheres, such as business and family and churches. However, they do want to provide the framework needed to keep the economy working efficiently. So that's a little bit about the individualistic. And then as far as the political cultures, it talked a little bit about how that there was a discovery that powerful national policy movements could overwhelm the importance of political culture. The impact of national movements such as policy areas as school desegregation and special education was apparent in all 6 states, regardless of their political cultures. Their second major finding, however, was that the absence of a national movement, policy differences do emerge. So, and that's really about all that I had for that section. As far as the implications for school administrators, this basically just talked about that we have to be very aware of what's going on in our political cultures. And then as far as leading to a traditionalistic setting, men and women have selected to serve as school leaders in traditionalistic settings are usually people who are acceptable to the local elite, either because they are already part of the established order or because they came from a familiar setting. And then if you were someone who was leading in a moralistic setting, the school leaders usually have the advantage that citizens consider education an important contribution to the common good, and they're inclined to support it. However, people who are part of this culture also expect to be very involved in the government. And then if you were someone who was leading in an individualistic setting, those find themselves in roles, should bear in mind that people in this culture tend to have a pragmatic economic orientation. So in that setting, a leader has to make certain that they're running the school system basically almost like a business setting. And that's really all I have. My final point was just that you just got to know what political culture you're really working in, and then be able to acclimate yourself to their needs.
That's right. You got to know the players. All right. Good job. But I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Pam?
No, I just did not hear your last comment.
I said you got to know the players.
Okay.
All right, Karen, you're up.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Yep, we can.
Okay. So in chapter 7 was about the involvement of policy, starting with the issue and making it to an agenda. So go back to slide 1. The author starts out with an illustration describing perception and reality, and we have to look at how policies are developed through different lenses, and everybody's lens is a little different. And also the illustration gives you an idea of how policy can be influenced by other people's perceptions. So he discussed a situation where a teacher or a professor was having the students look through a telescope, and he had positioned it just right to where they could see a special star or a planet or something. And child after child would come up and look through the telescope, and they shook their head. Yeah, we saw the star. And then after several, one of the students demanded he could not see it, so he exasperatedly walked over and checked, and the lens cap was still on the end of it. And so I think the point of that was just the author was saying, it's not a problem until it is a problem, until the squeaky wheel speaks up and says, hey, look, there's an issue here. And so that's what happens a lot of times in policy development. So the two visible stages of policy development or formation, the first one is issue definition. I think Lakeisha mentioned earlier that policies don't just come from thin air. They aren't just thought up from people, these things out there. Typically, they come from a problem that's turned into an issue. So the author gives the situation of the problem is students are not motivated, and so the issue that's derived from policy or from the problem is that students should have to maintain a C average or higher to be eligible for a driver's license.
Yeah, welcome to North Carolina.
So that was just one example of how. That's right. Yeah, I thought that was unfamiliar. So that's just one example of how that small problem, people start turning around thinking, how can we work to solve that? So,
hey, Karen, I have a quick
question. The author, sure.
Can I ask a quick question? So the slide before you had the issue definition, you had school choice. So what just out of the top of your head, what do you think the problem or the issue definition would have been for the solution to be school choice?
Oh, I'm glad you brought that up, because I didn't mention that was one of the examples that was given. And thinking about the issue is school choice. The problems, there's probably an array of different problems that came from that. It could have just been
schools of failing.
Dissatisfaction. It could be the political environment that we live in.
Yep.
Yes, go ahead.
And sometimes it could be just made up stuff. It could be the privatization of education. So,
Right.
It doesn't necessarily have to be a real issue. It could be something that people make an issue. Like these people who want to privatize education, school choice is a great way to do that. So sometimes people make an issue to make it become a policy. Go ahead. Sorry. And you're kind of cutting.
And I think that goes back to the perception thing. Okay. I wonder what I can. Let me know if there's something you think I can do to solve that. I don't know.
You're asking me?
Is it any better or
It's
no different?
better.
Yeah. Okay. I'll keep going. Just stop me if it gets where you can't hear me very well. So the authors referred to Education Policy Planning and Research Committee, the EPPRC, and these are the influential bodies that impact policy definitions. So there's two main bodies. They're either sponsored educational research, like foundations and corporations, or it's universities that study educational policy. And so some of the ones mentioned that make up this, what they call the think tank of policy development education, are listed here. You've heard Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation, Ford Foundation, Harvard University, Stanford, are leading in that research. And the funding for the EPPRC comes from three major sources: corporations, wealthy individuals, and government. And those can be given in the form of grants, donations, or contracts. Okay. So skillful issue definition. So there's 5 components of issue definition. It starts off with a claim. So the example is given is, if schools had to compete with each other for students, they would use their resources more wisely. That's the claim. So basically 2 claims can be derived from that statement. First, that's implying that schools do not use their resources wisely. And secondly, it's assuming there's a lack of competition that causes inefficiency. And so from that claim, they look at the evidence on how to back up their claim. So a lot of times they'll use these big statistical numbers, anecdotal notes, and just stories, word of mouth. And then the third component, solutions. So typically they try to develop a realistic solution to the problem that is both financially and politically feasible. An example, going back to the school choice model, we have to think of different ways that, like you said earlier, there's something is not a problem, but they turn it into a problem. And the solution, they make it sound really great, because school choice, well, who doesn't want to have choice in something? So the solution has to be, and it goes up to the broad appeal, which is issue or component number 5. So they try to play on the discourse, the emotional language that's linked to the deep values, hopes, and fears. And again, looking at school choice, who wouldn't want school choice? Is all about it's worded. They'll sometimes use metaphors. School choice draws on the athletic metaphor of competition. It's linked to the American values of freedom and individualism. And again, it appeals to a broad audience. So some of the constraints to issue definition, ideas, values, and ideologies, obviously, those are not consistent among our population. So sometimes those are roadblocks to defining issues. Constitutionality, we have to be sure that the policies are in agreement with the Constitution. I think Pam touched on that some. And then popular values and mechanisms. So that's issue definition. Once the issues defined about on a policy agenda. So you have to catch the interest of policymakers to make it to an agenda of some sort. And so there's a graphic on page 163. I think you can see it there on the slide, that shows how the different agendas, you have the problems that are identified, and then within that problem, it makes it to a professional agenda, to the media and the public, and then overall the government agenda. So you can see the relationships of those different parts there. Okay. So when you making it to a governmental agenda, well, let me go back for a minute, policy agenda piece. So we have to get influential political leaders involved, or it could be from a triggering event of some sort. So a lot of times it'll skip some of these steps because something big happens, which is a catalyst for policy making. So can you think of things that may have happened in your experience that's created this a quick policy turnaround? Any examples you can think of? Anybody?
I got one.
The first one that came to my mind. Okay, go ahead.
Sputnik in the 1950s.
Sorry.
Sputnik, the Russians landing a man or shooting up spacecraft. It made us concentrate, changing on science and math, really big, pushed into schools. That was mine.
Great. That was great. The first one that came to my mind was like mass school shootings and how that was a catalyst for lots of school safety measures and policies around school safety. Any others you can think of?
What about the quality of reading that our students, maybe not the quality, the achievement or the lack thereof of reading, therefore a focus on K2, K3 with Read to Achieve?
Yeah.
How we compare nationally.
And even before that, you know, with the No Child Left Behind,
Subgroups.
the gap in math and reading.
All right. And the emphasis on subgroups. Every child being able to succeed.
I have one. When the one about,
Okay.
what's the name of it? What was the letter, y'all, that was written? Nation at Risk.
Yes, the book, 1983, Nation at Risk.
Yes,
Yeah,
that really spurred policy change.
Yeah, it did.
What policies came out of that? A Nation at Risk.
That's when we had the No Child Left Behind.
You
From there,
you also had an emphasis on STEM coming out of
all of those.
That's also, you had an
And the
emphasis
high school
on,
reform.
And the
from
secondary, yeah. What is it, ESSEA or something like that? ESSA, kind of like ESSA, but the other one.
EESA.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
ES. Yeah.
Okay. So typically that's kind of how that works. Either it goes through these steps, these phases, or a triggering event can and kind of bypasses some of those things, and it's a catalyst for quick turnaround, for quick change. So, so getting on those governmental agendas, unfortunately, all citizens don't have the same influence on policy agenda. Typically, your influential, wealthier people have a lot more influence on policy. Get to my notes. Talked about that. Sometimes interest groups, if there are certain interest groups that are out there, they may have ulterior motives. For example, they might share information and influence policy as well. And once it's on an agenda, it doesn't mean it's always going to stay there. So the author mentions that sometimes we have to make a conscious effort, keep it on an agenda, keep it at the forefront of the decision making. So how can school leaders impact policy in the early stages? It's not always obvious. You have to stay a step ahead. Influencing issue definition is more difficult for everyday educators. At the national level debate, you can challenge at the local level a little more frequently. And sometimes you have to develop a task force when these issues come to light in the public and the media. Then locally, you find yourselves having to develop these task force or problem solving around these same issues locally. So as leaders, we need to stay well informed. We develop allies, organizational effectiveness to act fast, and a lot of times you have a very short window of time on which you have attention to an issue. You may want to reach out to the media. You may want to reach out with workshops, conferences, releasing a press release, civic organizations, send articles to your legislators. So that would help an issue stay on political or the agenda. Say that again. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Yeah, something's going on with the mic. I thought it was my mic.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure who that was. Just interrupt me if you want to comment on that. Sometimes influencing issue definition is more difficult. I went to that issue. So sometimes we want to add attention to an issue or increase attention with an issue, but sometimes we want to reduce the attention. And so you have to persuade policymakers that the proposal is not financially feasible. Typically, Fowler says that's the best way to negate a policy or negate claims. That has to be, you can't just go out and make a claim that's totally unrealistic, and sometimes that can backfire on you. The scare tactics don't always a situation. So that is policy definition and policy agenda making. Are there any questions about those or comments? Okay.
Hey, Karen, one quick question. Can you hear me, Karen? Can anyone else? Karen, can you hear me?
Yes.
One quick question. How did Betsy DeBose become our Secretary
Yes.
of Education?
She was appointed by our president, who was then, she was approved by our Congress. Our
I know, but how did she get the job? That's the most important job in education. The woman can barely speak.
She is part of
Had the
very
influence.
influential policymaker. She's in with the big wigs.
It's called money.
The president.
Yes, it's called money, money, money. The lady
Right.
is,
And that goes back to the how
some
we're
people
all
are
not
more
created equally when it comes to policy.
Yeah, some people are more important than others. All right. Let's do this. Pam, I know you're up. Do you mind very much if we take a 2 to 3 minute break, bathroom break? More from me probably than you all. And we'll come back in about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay? All right. Pam, I now have you as the host. All right, you want to go ahead and start back? I know the others will join us, but I don't want to keep us here all night.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, we're looking at Policy Studies for Leadership, Chapter 8. And Chapter 8 really talks about stages 3 and 4, which is formulation and adoption of policy. And they are very public arenas, unlike steps 1 and 2 that are not as public. And it was noted in the chapters that sometimes people don't even realize steps 1 and 2 exist. So the three major processes are: first, it needs to be expressed in written language. And the written language is really important. It doesn't seem like it would be as difficult a task as it seems to be, but it's very difficult to decide on word choice because of the range of meaning. And so that's where we get things like may and shall and must and should and all those different verbiages that can mean different things, and trying to pinpoint the wording so that it is interpreted the way that the writer intends for it to be interpreted, or that it's vague enough because they want it to be vague enough. Either one. And then second, looking at funding or the money, legislatures have a choice of whether or not laws will be funded or not. And a lot of times it's dependent on how that affects them, because they are elected officials. So they may not want to fund a law due to the fact that it might include raising taxes. And that's where we get unfunded mandates, which cause great stress for us as educators, which seems like we do have those. One that comes to mind most recently is the unfunded mandate for class size that we faced, and it caused a lot of stress in our district, trying to find monies, and we ended up taking away my AIG coordinator position at the elementary school and putting them into a classroom at the middle school, and then moving a high school teacher out of a position down to the middle school. And we funded those increases of class size at the elementary school by changing around positions here. We didn't hire anybody. So we lost services for our kids. It didn't cost us any more money, but it did cost us. And so can you think of any other unfunded mandates?
It's like get in line. Every one of them they send us here lately has been unfunded.
Yes.
Reduce class size.
Yes. Thank you. And the third is adoption. For adoption of a law, it has to have the majority vote in both the House and in legislature, and then the executive must sign, or they could veto. The policy formulation adoption from the legislature's point of view is designed, when our forefathers first designed the process, it was made difficult on purpose. And why would they want it to be difficult to pass a law? Kristen? I don't know if anybody else is out there. I can only see you.
Oh, I'm here.
Okay.
So that everybody and your mama wouldn't be coming up making different laws and stuff.
Yes, it just that way they can't switch them back and forth so quickly to change things in a whim. First, that to make a proposal for a legislator can come from a legislature. It can come from a chief executive, such as the governor or the state or the president and federal and their committees, and also administrative agencies and interest groups. Legislatures can develop, draft, and introduce directly into his or her own house a law, whereas the others don't have the option to introduce a law into or a proposed law or policy into law, because they have to find a sponsor through the legislature. So your chief executives, administrative agencies, and interest groups can develop a proposal and they can draft it, but it has to be introduced to the House by their sponsor. And choosing sponsors is very tricky. They need to make sure they choose wisely, because even choosing the wrong sponsor could prevent their policy from becoming a law. And in the lower and upper houses, they follow the procedure of a bill is introduced and you have the first read, and then the committee has hearings, vote, and report, have a second read, then there's a third reading, and they could have a floor debate. Sometimes things get hung up in committee, or they get hung up in the floor debate and don't make it to vote. Conference committee, and then a final vote, and then the governor has the choice, or the president has the choice to sign or veto a bill. I have, and I probably won't play it on the interest of time, but in my presentation, I have the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law, in my presentation, but I won't play it for you since you all know it. But it really
there's a revised one too that's much more interesting than the old one.
Yeah, they're really good.
And the side here too is that North Carolina, this really looks great, this lower and upper houses, but in North Carolina now, every new bill, almost everything comes in the budget bill. So even policies, I mean, if you look for something new, it's in the budget bill. So there's really not a lot of discussion about the merits of a new policy, because who's going to vote against the budget? Yeah, that's bad.
And they sneak things in there on us and surprise us.
Last minute.
One of the things that the picture of the hurdle in the right-hand side really indicates the hurdles that sometimes they're just put in place, like committee after committee after committee, and it's really difficult sometimes for policies to come up for a vote. There's also policy formulation adoption from the administrative agencies. And administrative agencies really fill that gap that when a law is written vaguely by legislatures and they develop the rules, regulations, and policy guidelines. The three functions of those administrative rules are that they fill the gaps and of laws that were not either they weren't recognized or picked up on by the legislators, or they were just left on purpose for experts to determine. And they define key terms in the law or the body of the law and define the internal procedures. Rules are written following 3 steps, which is gathering information, providing for public participation, and submitting the proposed rules to a designated individual or panel for approval. These administrative agencies and what they do with their functions of rules are really helpful because they help facilitate more responsive and flexible implementation of new policies and make the rules and laws easier. The rules are easier to change than a policy. So if they wanted to change a law, there's a lot more steps to make that happen. Whereas if it's just within the rule or the guidelines, then it can be changed much faster if it's faulty or not working correctly. Federally, rules are based on policies and the public is given notice of the intention to write rules and require a permit for public participation. There's also policy formation adoption from the courts. The judiciary branch is reactive rather than proactive. So judiciary members, even if they see a law that they feel like is unjust or is not shouldn't be the way it is, they don't act on that themselves until a citizen or group pursue that judicial remedy in court. And then their trial courts at the lowest level are both state and federal, and there you have a single judge who hears the case and the evidences. And then above that, there's the trial court. It has a panel of judges that hears a case. The U.S. Supreme Court has 9 members, and the state Supreme Court has 7 members, and appellate courts, there are 3. State courts play an important role in policy, especially education policy for us. There's a lot of And then influencing policy formulation and adoption. So this is where I feel like the rubber really meets the road for us, and why it's so important as school leaders to know the process, to understand legal codes, to follow government activity, and watch the news, read articles, pay attention to what's coming up based on what our legislators are doing. A lot of that can come through professional organizations that kind of stay abreast. They have people that's their job to come out and make public what's coming up in education. So following those blogs or Twitter handles or different things like that can kind of keep you abreast of those things. Working together, where we work together at Elkin City, we're a member of the City Schools Consortium. So we have a group that works together to kind of pay attention and find those hidden little places where they put things about merging districts. And so we fight that together as a group rather than any of us single-handedly taking that on. That's one example I can think of where we're working together has been really beneficial for Elkin City. And then set your priorities to make sure that you're paying attention to the right things. 3 approaches that we can take to influencing is having government relations, and that's knowing who your legislatures and your representatives are and making contact with them in the appropriate ways. Locally, being out and about and knowing who to talk to and when to talk to them, being members of professional organizations, and lobbying. And that's not being a lobbyist, it's lobbying. So knowing what you need and what your needs are, and working in conjunction with either those professional organizations or governments representatives so that you can make clear that they understand what you need and why it's important that they vote the way that you would like them to vote, or that they help you put things in place that need to be in place. So I found for North Carolina, you can find out who your representatives are, and I put the link in here for you. I'm going to go to that. So if you go here to the North Carolina General Assembly, you can go here and say who represents me, and then there will be a map that shows you, and you find your location, and then once you find your county, it will tell you who is representing you, and you can find all the different offices there of who represents you, and from the House, Senate, and Congress, and then by county you can search for it and then look at other records there. It's a great resource. You can also look at bills that are coming up or things like that under at the top, but there's some good information there. So that is chapter 8.
All right. Any questions from anybody? I am going to take it back from you.
Okay. Let me cancel out. I think I have to. Maybe I don't.
You have to give it to me.
Yes. I am working to do that. Okay.
All right. Thank you, Pam. Any questions for Pam? Great job. All right. Moving on to chapter 9. Kristen, let me give it to you. Kristen. Let's see. What does it say?
I've got it.
Okay.
So I did not do a PowerPoint. I just did an outline. I think I have the most interesting chapter in the book. It talks about analyzing policy, and it gives us 3 different lenses in which to do this. And the 2 reasons that the author lays out in the beginning is that administrators need to know how to adopt and develop policies, which is something that we practiced this weekend. And then we also need to understand how to implement and the policy that we develop, but also policy that is developed by others. And whenever the text uses administrators, it's not only meaning school-based administrators, but I believe administration at the district level, like your superintendent as well. So the first lens that we are going to look at is Lowey's techniques of control. And he looked at the 3 types of policy: distributive, regulatory, and redistributive types of policy. So distributive policies are subsidies, contracts, non-regulatory licensing, distribution as control, and then distributive politics. And that means kind of like how you would navigate this type of policy. And so the subsidies are the cash, service, or land that is acquired. Contract would be when a private firm agrees to do a service for an amount of money. So when I was thinking of our district, I was thinking about a contract. We have contracted mowing. We have someone in our district who does heating and air, but when it gets above our expertise and we have to call and train, we contract with them at some of our schools. I know some districts contract out transportation. Other types of contracts would be textbooks, how you have the 5-year, you use a textbook and you pay for it for 5 years, and you have that contract with them. So another distributive policy would be a non-regulatory licensing, where privileges are granted by the government to do something that would otherwise be considered illegal. So something that came to my mind would be teaching your AIG students, because I know, and it's not necessarily would be illegal, but it's not, you need to have your academically gifted license in order to teach those children. And that was just something that came to my mind whenever I was reading that. I know in our district we offer local. You have a state certification, and we offer a local certification where you can get trained locally for that.
The one I think about may be pre-K services.
Yes.
Some districts would give that to a private vendor who may not have the standards that we have to have in a public school setting?
I think that we have, Karen, are we licensed by outside agency? I think we are in our pre-K.
No, we
Is it?
no.
I know
we're
we-
licensed through the North Carolina Department of Childhood Education, but
Okay.
it's not contracted out.
Okay.
There are people.
Okay. And then I guess I was thinking of the licensing, but that's just the number of stars that we have. But that is through the state, right? Regulated. Okay. And then distribution as control, where it encourages the district to provide services to students. And some of the example I gave in the book was like a free and reduced lunch program, and that is so that everyone is provided with a meal, and it gives the person creating the policy some form of control over how it is done. And then the politics surrounding distributive policies and how to navigate those is that when they are given out equally, consistently, and without impartiality, it reduces the amount of conflict. So everybody's kind of getting the same amount of services whenever they're distributed out evenly. So you can have examples that it mentioned were grants and your transportation type money. Another policy that we're looking at from Lowy is regulatory policies, that formal rules expressed in general terms. So there are different types, and it lists examples in the book on page 217. For example, your teacher certification is you have to have a license to do that. You have to have a license to be an administrator. Graduation requirements, and there's a whole list there that you can look at that are regulations by the state and then the local bodies. So the politics or how to navigate this would be that you can have different interest groups have differences of opinions about some of these policies, and that can sometimes be cause waves when you're navigating policy. And then you have the redistributive policies, where we have the shifts in resource or power that goes from one social group to another. So Social Security was an example. It's not a form of insurance, but it is redistribution of income through taxation. So that was the example there. The politics is that it can be very controversial, just because of the nature of what it is.
Think Medicare expansion.
Yes, that's another one. So with the redistributive policies, it talks about, or is it one or the other? Whenever you're looking at it through this lens, is it regulatory or is it redistributive? And it basically, in the short term, when you're looking at a short term policy, it can seem to have a characteristic of one over the other. But when you're looking at it in the long term, you're going to see characteristics of both types. And so when you're applying this lens to how you or we as administrators are looking at different policies, some of the tips that were given are that we need to be able to anticipate the different types of political situations that will come from adoption of policies. We need to be able to manage the policy change and how we roll it out. We need to be able to understand the influence and how we're planning influence and strategies. We also need to have different strategies for the different types of policy that could come out, because as the district leader or the school leader, when you are ensuring that everyone's following them, you have to have a strategy for how you're going to do that and to be consistent across, in a large area so that everybody is consistent. So Lens 2 talks about the instruments. Let's see, Lens 1 was how to maintain the idea of control over the policies. And then the 2 is the different instruments that are the policies. And so McDonnell and Elmore are the ones who were quoted in researching this. So mandates, and they talked about translating the policy goals into concrete actions, and that's how you can physically implement the policy. So there are different instruments that can be used in implementing these policies. You can make mandates where you have to do it, and this is one of the most popular ways to ensure that policy is followed. Inducements, capacity building, system change, and then hortatory policy or through the power of persuasion. And so the author just talks about the different ideas of what these are. So let me go to my notes. So hold on, let me get my notes. Okay, so mandates are the ruling of governing the actions of individuals. So you, like I said, you enforce it, you govern the way that it's carried out. The inducements would be a transfer of money to an individual or agency in return for the production of a good or a service. And so there's an exchange there. And then something that I noted was that because school districts and schools serve different populations and must therefore meet different needs, inducements offer an opportunity to develop flexible and responsive programs that can be tailored to your specific needs. So another way of ensuring that the policies are, getting met are capacity building. And so you invest in the people. Maybe it's through investing in resources or increasing the human capacity for the policy and how it's implemented. And then a system change might be appropriate policy when new behavior is needed, but the currently employed staff and existing institution are unresponsive to the demands that are changed. So maybe a shift in the principles or something that would affect the whole system rather than just a single individual. And then the power of persuasion is another way to get a policy implemented. And examples in schools include campaigns to encourage children to recycle trash as a way to ensure that recycling program is happening.
The big one now is the plastic straws. Have y'all dealt with that? Outlawing plastic straws?
You know what? My daughter, we actually went out to dinner last night, and when we talked about that, the waiter automatically gave us straws, and she said, "Mama, that is illegal." I was like, "What are you talking?" She's the one who told me about it, and She said, "It's pollution. It's bad for the environment. It's getting And so my 11-year-old informed me about the one with plastic straws last night.
A lot of our restaurants.
My 10-year-old did the same thing.
Yeah. Now, are they actually trying to ban them, or they are just trying to say the customer needs to ask for them rather than we're automatically giving them out?
I think they're going away.
Really?
Our restaurants have all switched to like a paper straw.
Yeah.
Okay.
In Caldwell County, before I left, we were looking at a policy for our cafeteria where we did not offer them, and we took them away. I don't know what happened to it because it was in transition when I did it, but I know it was on our radar.
Yeah. We don't use straws.
Here's a question for you.
Ours.
And this really probably isn't a school question, but how do you take a cardboard or paper straw and put the crinkles in it so the straw bends for hospital patients? I said hospital patients, not me.
I don't know that answer.
It's a good question, though, right?
It is a good question. We'll let our hospitals deal with that policy.
Yeah.
Good question.
It might benefit our pre-K students, though, being able to have a big...
You cannot discriminate.
It might be something you might find out and put a patent on and get rich.
Okay, well, if I knew how to do that, I would.
Yeah. All right, let us know. We'll help you.
Put your husband on that.
Okie dokie. I will have the maintenance director do that.
So just moving on, McDonald and Elmore talked about their ideas for school leadership, and to diversify policy instruments where they considered that mandates were probably overused, and then if you combine policy instruments, it offers more of a long-term strategy. And it gave a scenario where you combined like several of the hortatory policies and used persuasion to implement a change. Whereas it gave, the principal was walking through the school and the school was dirty. And so one scenario said that he could just mandate that you have to do this, you have to do this. And if you don't do this, then there are punitive consequences. Whereas if you, on the alternative, if you combined multiple hortatory policies and you persuaded and built the capacity of people to notice and recognize the litter in the school, then that may be better than a mandate. And it went through that whole scenario. And then the last lens that you can consider policy is the cost. So anytime there's money involved, that always raises eyebrows. And so, which I think it's where we are limited on the funding that we have, cost and cost analysis, and whether it's cost effective are two things to consider. When you think about cost, it talks about it gave another example of 4 approaches to increasing students' math scores. And you could add an additional day to the school, you could add computer-assisted instruction, cross-age adult tutoring, and then reduce class sizes were some of the options. And the tutoring program, if in this scenario, if you weighed it out, would have been the more cost-effective. It may not have been the cheapest up front, but for the sustainability over time, whenever you consider it out. So it's important not to just jump on the cheapest thing, because you may end up pouring more money into that over time. They warned against do not adopt new policy without realistically analyzing the cost and/or the cost effectiveness. Anytime you're budgeting, I think that's very important.
Someone should tell the General Assembly that.
Yes, maybe do an audit there or something. So then we have the cost analysis, where you calculate the expenditure. Basically, you make a budget. And you look at the opportunity cost, and it talked about 5 different ingredients, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, where you have personnel, the facilities, equipment and materials, the client input, and then your miscellaneous. By doing this analysis, you reduce the amount of unanticipated expenditures, and it's an easy way to see when it's detailed out like that. You can look at ways to save money as well. Let's see. Moving on. All right, so thinking about the effectiveness of this, we have tangible and intangible costs and benefits. So do the potential benefits that are there outweigh the costs? And then with an analysis of cost effectiveness, it's important to compare different methods for reaching the same goal. So don't just go out with the first person who comes and gives you a bid. Look at all the different options that you have. Identify what are you truly trying to obtain through this policy. What measures are you going to, how will you measure the effectiveness of the program or the policy? And then what is the cost, and have you identified the 5 ingredients? Have you looked at ways to cut and not spend as much? And then look at all your alternatives, and then you're able to make a sound decision after you have looked at all of those things. So now you know how to analyze policy, through different lenses. Any questions?
I'll have to tell you, Kristen, that
Yeah.
was the most, you did a great job on it, but that was the boringest chapter in the entire book. And that's
I agree with you.
That's a hard thing to sell on that particular book, but that was truly, I was wondering how you were going to handle that. You did a great job. So good job.
Well, you know, I thought since it was so boring, I could not even fluff it up with pretty background. Actually, wait a minute. I'll do that for you. Give me one. Like, I'll just do this right here. Here you go.
Hey, make it pretty.
Like hot pink for you there. How's that?
I thought maybe you would have some music or something to go along with it. All
Well,
right.
I honestly considered a video, but I just don't think I could have done this in a Powtoon, and it would have been a slammed a Powtoon.
It would have been hard. All right. Chapter 10, Tabitha is not with us tonight, so we're going to jump on down. And we will be through except for chapter 10 next week. But Lakeisha, are you ready for chapter 11? Let me turn it over to you. Where are you?
Yes.
There you are. Let me see. No, you can take it, right? Because I'm not sharing because you can take it.
Yes.
All right, you got it.
Hold on 1 second, I think.
It's all yours. Whenever you want it. Then we will be done with Fowler. I am so glad.
Hold on 1 second, please.
Okay.
What is? Oh, okay.
There you go. You got it now.
Yes, hold on a moment.
Chapter 11 was about as interesting as chapter 9.
I actually liked it.
Oh, good. Good.
Well, it was kind of really boring, but I kind of liked it. Hold on 1 second, because I have to get my my notes up.
All right. You take your time. We're waiting.
Okay. What? Presentation notes. Questions, notes. Open speaker notes. Oh, I know what happened. Oh, phooey. All right. Hold on a minute. So we have the same book, and it's chapter 11. And I actually forgot to put the title. Sorry. What was the name of chapter 11 again? I'm sorry.
Policy evaluation.
Thanks. Policy evaluation. Okay. So we're starting with the definitions associated with policy evaluation. So the professional terminology that may not be familiar to outsiders may be evaluation, policies, projects, and stakeholders. So evaluation is the systematic investigation of the quality of programs, projects, or any of their components for purposes of decision making, leading to improvement, and or accountability. Policies are often first put into effect through projects. So for example, when the federal government adopted compensatory education as a national policy, it funded short-term Head Start, and Title I projects in many school districts. So with that, are there any projects that your school districts have put in place, or your schools that you can think of prior to it becoming a policy? I'm asking.
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, Lakeisha.
It's okay. I said, can you all think of any projects that turn into policies in your school district?
What about accelerated reading?
Oh, okay.
Accelerated reader.
Sure. We don't have it as a policy, but
We didn't at the beginning, but then we had to go back and do it because people were not using it like the district wanted them to use it. So we had to go back and make it a policy.
Cool. Anybody else? Project. I think when I think of this, The one that comes to my mind, I live in the alternative world of education. So what was kind of a project at first was what we call 12th Street Academy. And so then it turned into the community involvement program. And so now it is part of our policy where it's a place where kids go who have not been successful in the quote unquote regular alternative setting. So within our two schools for behavior, which is Main Street Academy and Kingswood School, if they can't be successful there, then they'll go to the community involvement, or better known as CIP program. So that's one of the ones that I believe they kind of tinker with it at first, and it wasn't set up for academic purposes at that time. It was based upon community service hours and that type of thing. But now it's an academic setting. So when projects are institutionalized, they become programs. So just like I said, now it's the community involvement program. So stakeholders, these are all those individuals or groups who have a legitimate interest in or served in some meaningful way by the program. So we can think back to our session together this weekend, where we can even think of the interest groups being stakeholders. Because when you think interest groups, I know for me, I didn't think of them as a stakeholder, but they are very well stakeholder. I thought about stakeholders as being your typical, your parents, your community leaders, that type of thing. But when you think about it in forms of interest groups, they are stakeholders as well. So I made that connection. A brief history of educational policy evaluation. So in early evaluation, it was in the United States, educational evaluation can be traced to pre-Civil War Boston, where Horace Mann, my insurance person, and the Board of Education gathered examination data in order to compare schools. I actually had to deal with some of that in our previous class. The war on poverty. This goes back with because of the ESEA, what I was referencing earlier. Educational evaluation became a growth industry. Several people who eventually made major reputations in policy evaluation, such as Michael Scriven and Robert State, actually switched from other fields in order to participate in this unusual opportunity to develop and refine the evaluation of educational policies. And then the professionalization of evaluation. So about 1973, evaluation began to mature as a field and to emerge as a distinctive profession within education. The characteristics of policy evaluations. So these are briefly summarized in this section. Determine the goals of the policy. You have to, before it becomes a policy, you have to determine the goals of the policy. Select indicators. Select or develop data collection instruments. Collect data. Analyze and summarize the data. Write an evaluation report. Respond to evaluators' recommendations. So, in a sense, it kind of goes back to when we did our program evaluations, guys. Y'all does that kind of make a connection for you, or make sense, not make sense? Hello?
I wasn't there.
Huh?
I wasn't there.
Okay. So the criteria for judging evaluations, you have to think about the utility, feasibility, the propriety, and the accuracy of it. Then there are different methodologies, just like in doing our dissertation or any other type of experiment. You have the quantitative as well as qualitative. So some of the things that can be gathered for your quantitative methodologies are transcripts of interviews, open-ended surveys, Diaries, I thought that was very interesting. Minutes from meetings, official reports, legal documents, photographs. Some of the qualitative methodologies can be like, of course, your well, I didn't think test score, but test scores, retention rates, attendance figures, dropout rates, per pupil expenditures, teacher salaries, teacher per pupil ratios, and so on and so forth.
Right. Those are facts. Kristen, can you give a good definition between quantitative and qualitative? I'm just kidding. She got that question Tuesday. Did a great job on it.
I know she did. And congratulations, by the way, Kristen.
Thank you.
Facilitating meaningful policy evaluations. Evaluations are political for 3 reasons. So, first, the programs and projects that they assess are the products of the political process. Second, evaluation reports influence what happens in the political arena, often affecting whether policies continue and how much funding it receives. So, I kind of think about that too, in the sense of like, even take for instance what you said, Dr. Stone. You said, hey, I started it, but I don't know where it is now. A lot of times things get dropped because of who, or started because of who's in there, and stopped because of who left. So that's what I kind of think about. And that's it. And when we think about political arena here, we're not thinking about the federal or the state, but it's your micro political pieces too that plays an important role in policy. Finally, the careers, professional reputations, and the educational benefits of many individuals depend on the outcome of any evaluation. So this means that politics, often politics of the crescent sort, surround every evaluation. So wise education leaders will not deny the political aspects of the process, hoping they do not emerge in their setting. So instead, they anticipate and plan for them, like we talked about in chapter 3. So you have to be aware of those things. So acting on an evaluation report. So after the school leaders receive and study an evaluation report, they must decide what to do about it. So I have all this information, now what? First, you can have inaction, or often and they said it, Fowler said that this is often the wisest course of action, which is to do nothing, thus maintaining the current policy in place. Now, Dr. Stone, I kept reading on that, but I just didn't really understand it. Why?
Well, think of it this way. Sometimes, let's just say something happens in Winston-Salem for a site, and a parent comes to the board and gets real excited because, I don't know, maybe her kid was bullied in the band.
Okay.
Now, and so, 1 or 2 board members may say, well, maybe we need to change our band policy about traveling to away games where there has to be a monitor in the front of the bus, the middle of the bus, and the back of the bus. Now, if you're superintendent, you're hoping, good God, I hope this goes away, because I have no way of finding 3 people to be on the bus. So that's when you do nothing. You kind of when the board members talk about it, you kind of drag your heels and you don't do something, because in the long run, that little incident was one, and it will go away with time.
Got you. Yeah, I understand now.
That's it. Oh, we do that a lot, Lakeisha. We do that a lot. That's a lot of times when you approach your superintendent about, or if you say, people say we need a policy about this, that, and the other, the superintendent will just nod. And just won't do anything about it. It'll go away in its due time. When it doesn't go away, then you have to write a policy. But most things go away.
Okay, I understand now from that perspective. I actually had to do some of that tonight. It has nothing to do with policy, but one of the students I work, we have they work on the computers to complete their courses, and so the teacher came and said, well, this student can't get in the computer and that type of thing. Well, now that I know, pretty much what to expect, I didn't act. So I didn't realize that I was doing, actually doing it. I didn't act on it. I kind of, drug my heels a little bit and kind of questioned it. And then by the time I finished with my questioning, they had the student logged in. So that was good. Yeah. All right. So minor modifications can also be made. Minor modifications do not affect the spending or staffing levels of the program, nor do they alter the objectives of the policy. So examples include changing the test to monitor student progress, modifying schedules, or providing additional materials similar to those already in use. Can anybody come up with some minor modifications that may been put in place for a policy once things? All right. So there are some major modifications that can also be taking place, and here are the 4 methods. You can do replacement, consolidation, splitting, or decrementing. What do you call it? How do you say that? Decrementing?
I've never seen the word.
Me
except
either.
in the book, so pronounce it like you want.
Okay, Fowler's very smart. So replacement, the explanation there is it's a new program with the same objectives, and it's put in place of the old program. So they just completely take it out and put another one in. Consolidations, where you have 2 or more entire programs or parts of programs are combined. Splitting is one aspect of the program that is removed and developed into a separate program or a project. And this decrementing is a substantial cut in funding is imposed on the program by reducing the amount of money available to most components of the old program. I'm going to do something right quick. Let me see.
I think of that as kind of starving it.
Okay, now, all right. Go ahead, Doc. I'm sorry.
I think of that as kind of starving the program. Just cut off the money.
Cut it off. Just leave it alone.
All right.
Okay. So I'm pretty much I'm done.
All right. Anybody have any questions? All right. So if you will turn it back over to us.
Okay. Hold on 1 second. I'm sorry. Stop share. Got it.
Right. Okay. We have one more. We're done for the night. Pam? Pam, you are chapter 12. You are the end of the Fowler book. So this was probably the most exciting chapter, the most full of stuff. What say ye?
Well, honestly, I enjoyed the very end of this chapter. I think more than
I bet you did.
I did, because it got into some things that I feel like were a little bit more pertinent. I'm going to move quickly through this. I think that's the plan anyway. Again, we started out with how the education has changed basically through history. How do some of the proposals of today relate to the class? The environment today is very turbulent, and then why is it that way? And then it went back and started on its very first focus question, which was, if we aren't in Kansas, where are we? And I can remember, I was like, my goodness. But I remember us starting out like that. But it talked about a lot there in the very first of the section that, school administrators often feel like that they're perplexed, and they feel like that they have education reforms coming at them from all directions, such as politicians, business leaders, and so on. And then it said that, in universities, because, the universities feed in, and I know for us, we often get lots of student teachers from Appalachian. We've been very blessed and fortunate to be on that end of the county. However, sometimes, they bring their own ideas and everything, and sometimes we've got universities that actually may want to work with us, and they may have a program that they feel like would be beneficial and implemented in the school, and it may be that you don't you don't feel that way, but we're constantly having to ask ourselves what's happening, why is everybody dissatisfied with our schools, and then where is it all leading? And then that went on into some things about competing values. There were 3 different categories that they talked about. Was basically the social values, which was the order of values, the democratic values, which dealt with basically a lot of equality is what they talked about, the economic values as well, which dealt with the growth and the quality. There was a part in there that they talked about once a value becomes the highest priority in education, it tends to hold that position for a very long time. And then that is hard to change as far as values, upcoming values in the future. Loewy's policy was discussed also, and it basically said that there were 3 different types of policies: the distributive, the regulatory, and the redistributive. And basically each one of those would set a different political arena around themselves. And they talked about some institutional choices that basically they could, anytime that you were going to go and do an evaluation, you might want to look at the bureaucracy, the legalization, the professionalization, politics, and the market. And then as it continued on, it broke it down into bureaucracy as a hierarchical organization in which everyone has a clearly defined role. Legalized institution is one in which laws are ultimate instruments of control. Disputes are often settled by taking complaints to courts and then letting judges make those final decisions, and that goes again back to what we talked about earlier. And then members of an organizational structure, that professional are controlled internally by norms, and there is where that they are socialized by older people that are basically working in their field. And then the politics it broke down into can also be fundamental structural principle of an educational system. In a political situation, people build power in order to advance their own agendas and their own values. And then it talked about how that they could be broken down into markets, which is goods and services are produced by competitors and competing providers who try to attract customers by offering attractive prices or distinctive product features. There was a part then that began to talk in this section about the Young Republic, and it just gave some overviews. It talked about some of the older schools, or, in the very beginning, yes, basically there were no rules in the very beginning. I mean, there was no control, and it really wasn't a big issue because they looked at it like that they were beginning to actually reform and also educate some of the farmers, and they didn't have a time period on how much of the school year that a child had to be in school. There was no regulation as to, what the school had to even be comprised of. For example, you could actually have one that was basically in a home. They were used there as their own residence, sometimes even in a kitchen. And then sometimes they became more structured and advanced as they began to work on things just like handwriting in English. So those things begin to change during that time period. In rural areas, they talked about how that the schools would only operate for about 2 or 3 months, and sometimes that would just, again, be during the winter months. Toward the end of this period, cities began to sponsor public schools for poor children, and they often call those schools charity schools. They had a high pupil-teacher ratio, and although they taught the rudiments of reading and arithmetic, they emphasized hard work and obedience. And I'm just thinking back, we're back at that point where our teacher ratio to student ratio seems to be continuously going up. The competitive values was viewed from the perspective of the competing values framework. The values that drove education policy were basically individualism and freedom. There was also another policy that was called the perspective policy type, and that was distributive, and it had no regulatory strings attached other than those funds that they would be using during this time period had to be used for education. So that had a little bit to do with that. There was a part in the international convergence that they talked about, because education in the United States was so diverse and uncentralized, no formal exchanges could take place between U.S. educators and those from other parts of the world. But after all, they talked about how that the immigrants that actually were coming to the United States, when they had actually arrived, they were from more established societies sometimes, and we were sort of like a plethora and made up of all parts of the world. The rise of the common school from 1831 until 1900. It talked about the young republic was no longer young, that the United States was changing rapidly. Part of that was because of the industrialization, and as a result of that, there was population growth, and then spreading out to what used to be farmland, which began to bring more increased crime and poverty to areas that had not previously experienced that. It also became known as the Common School movement, and that was the goal of the Common School movement was actually to reform American education. And then this part goes back and begins to tie in with what Lakeisha was talking about earlier with Horace Mann. That basically he was a tireless lecturer and a prolific writer, and what he believed was that in order for them to decrease the crime and the crime rate in the United States, that basically if they would increase the education of everyone, that would decrease the crime rate. I was trying to think if there's anything else on that section. There was an institutional perspective as well, and that was where that both the local, it was established basically there were bureaucracy at both the local and the state levels, and under their guidance, the state departments of education were established, and they were directed by the superintendent of public instruction. And then there's also the international level, and they believed that the more that you could basically made a point of visiting European schools, especially those in France, in order to obtain some ideas. And then they tried to bring those back and begin to looking at what a very normal school to them would actually look like.
Hey, Pam?
Yes, sir.
One of the things I think folks might want to know too, that was in 1839 that North Carolina passed its first Education Act. So within that rise of the common school and Horace Mann, that's also where North Carolina public education got it started. Particularly the concept that not everybody would go to public schools, but certainly a select group of kids would have that opportunity for that common school. So North Carolina fell right in about the same time.
Okay. I'm looking to see. I've lost my place here. there's part of, here we go. I'm good now. As we continued, and I need to go, there we go. Through the remainder of that period, leaders considered the public schools as a major instrument of public policy, and their group could begin to meet a large range of social and economic trainings and needs. And then they also wanted to begin working on a lot of specific career directions. With that, they began working on ability grouping, extracurricular activities, and some of those things. It went on through and talked about a competing values perspective. And as it was looking at that, it's talked about during that time and looking at that viewpoint, decisions about children's learning were increasingly based on test scores rather than on teachers' professional judgment. The whole purpose of, and it's what it called the sorting machine, was to improve social efficacy by expeditiously channeling young people into tracks that would lead them into occupations that the U.S. society most needed. And I've sort of jumped around there just a little bit. It talked about some policy types perspectives, where that they had regulations were emphasized as time passed, and redistributive policies became increasingly popular. They had regulations that were very detailed and attached to them. And then it went on into and talked about the institutional choice perspective, where the scientific sorting machine era preferred bureaucracy, for it was consistent with their great faith in expertise. Therefore, they not only maintained the bureaucracy that had been put in place during the 19th century, but they also extended and strengthened it as well. And then it went from there. It led into the international convergent perspective, and this is the part that they talked about, that children whose probable career paths differed should pursue different education programs, and these should be offered in different separate schools. So,
right. This was the rise of the college prep. Those who are designed for college, those who go into vocational, those who are going to go straight to work. I mean, it really, just think of sorting, all the different ways in which we sorted kids. This is the beginning of it.
And the whole purpose of that was to produce, the sort of workers that both business and the military wanted.
Right. Key word there. We're providing the workers.
And then we go into the part that is 1983 until the present. Most of the problems in the United States have been basically blamed on the failure of schools to prepare their graduates adequately.
Lakeisha, what happened in 1983?
Nation at risk.
Yeah, you got it. I'm sorry, Pam.
No, you're fine. You're fine. There was it talks in here, it talked about the different types of reforms. And it basically said that the United States, several proposals for updating the school system coexisted in the political policy arena from 1983 on. And it talked about intensifying the old bureaucracy, structuring, and then redesigning. So I didn't spend a lot of time on that. I don't know, Dr. Stone, if you felt like we needed to. I've got some things highlighted.
I think the thing that you need to mention here is basically that we really are searching. we don't have a certain model that's going to work, and that's why we try No Child Left Behind. That's why we try Race to the Top. I have no idea, and that's why, well, Betsy DeVos is trying school choice. We really are searching for the next paradigm that's going to really make education move forward from 1983. So it's kind of an open market. Whatever's next is whatever the hot bad thing, or whoever's in the White House is generally what we're doing right now.
Well, and what you just said then brings us back over like to the competing values perspective.
Yep.
So some feel like that freedom and excellence as the two core values, and people need to have the choice. There's also the policy type perspective. Different branches of the reform movement prefer different policy types consistent with their fundamental loyalty. They had like the old common school. Those who advocated completing it often expressed their policy choices through regulatory mechanisms. Those who advocated either form of restructuring backed the distributive property, which we spoke about earlier, and then the advocates of greater professionalism, which wish to shift power from central offices to school buildings and from principals to teachers.
Site-based management.
Do what?
Site-based management.
Yes. And then school choice proponents, however, sought to shift power away from the educators of all types toward parents. So the institutional choice perspective, those who advocated for the completion of the old common school model, wanting to perfect several aspects, clarifying its rules, requirements, and so on. Proponents of increased professionalism argued for a greater professionalization of the teaching occupation, making it more like law and medicine. And then choice supporters favored the market with its diversity of producers as well as products and with its competition. And a lot of that brought us in line with No Child Left Behind. And this is the part that I looked at. I think I probably spent more time in it than anything. But as it started out, it said that the teacher professionalism movement would not have much impact on the new paradigm, because appealing as the full professionalism of teaching may be to many educators, it would be consistent with core American values. Instead, it predicted that the new paradigm would include numerous elements from both the updated Common School and the market models. So as it went in, it talked a little bit about, and it went all the way back to 2001 when Bush was inaugurated. He and his opponent, Al Gore, both had argued for higher academic standards and for more school choice during that time, during their campaigns. It talked about how that No Child Left Behind differed from past federal education laws in the fact that it didn't have, it called it teeth or any way of enforcing itself. And then the federal government can and would use the threat of withdrawing ESSA funds, or ESEA funds is what I should have said, to bring formidable pressure to bear on states and school districts. And then there were 4 theoretical lenses of that. And as it began to talk, it said on the surface, 2 values were predominant in No Child Left Behind, and it was basically freedom and equality. And I just want to say, I can remember when No Child Left Behind came into play. And one of the things, I had actually switched my professionalism had went from like a business state over to the educational realm. And I really, I look back upon that and I think about how naive I was, thinking that was actually going to be able to make an impact on parents. And it didn't, because really what it did is it put more pressure on us as educators. I was trying to think if there's anything else. Y'all, most of that stuff we've already talked about, and then it really comes down to the very end of that when it wants to know about will No Child Left Behind actually end up and be repeated. In here, it gave a breakdown about what was supposed to be or what did happen in 2007 and 8, and then the 2009 and 10. Congress actually met during the first 2 years of the Obama administration, focused on economic policy and ways to bring the country out of the Great Recession rather than on educational policy. So there was, in the beginning, it talked about how that there was a blueprint that was actually set for reform, and those were the words that it used. It talked about in 2010 how the congressional election slowed down the process. Not only did the Republicans take control of the House, but many of the newly elected representatives were members of the Tea Party movement and firmly opposed any federal role in education. It goes on to say the Department of Education is increasingly willing to make exceptions to its harsher provisions from early on, and it's also been willing to make waivers from the No Child Left Behind policy. No one should interpret any of those developments as meaning the standards-based accountability is going to suddenly vanish from American policy, period. Basic concepts that No Child Left Behind was built on are still foreseeable in the future. So as it ends, it says, then what then should our educational leaders do? And it talks about how that when our schools are struggling because of excessive testing and so on, and how that we're now beginning to find labels on us such as that we are failing. Educators, and it talked about how that we need to make certain that we're watching the way that we are actually wording things. It said educators who choose criticism of that central component are choosing a double-edged sword that has the potential to damage them more than it damages any of their opponents. It's extremely difficult for people whose salaries are being paid with public money and who operate school systems with public funds to sound credible when they start objecting to standards and assessments, because it makes it look like that we basically we oppose the accountability within itself, so we're saying that we are not credible. Rather than imposing the accountability system included in No Child Left Behind, leaders should say that they support accountability but believe that No Child Left Behind form must be improved. So that was, I thought that was interesting also there at the end. It goes back and talks about how that No Child Left Behind is actually flawed. And then it goes down to say educators should be asking themselves, about their state, looking at their state carefully. Are the tests used norm referenced or criterion referenced? If you're actually looking at what your state is using. Are they really aligned with the state's academic standards? Are all the questions multiple choice or types of objective questions? Or are all the children given a chance to write an essay and demonstrate how that they know to solve a problem? And then if the test falls short in any of those areas, then should they work with state officials to modify the assessments? It talked about how that we should also be more willing to inform educators ourselves as well about a more holistic approach and encourage both federal and state governments to use them. And it talked about, it talked about the two assessment types that we have, because, we already have proficiency, and then it talked about basically a value-added evaluation, which is our growth component. And then education leaders should learn more about the foreign school systems with which American schools are often compared. It went back and it encouraged us to make certain that, if we had an opportunity that we visited another country, to see, like, are they even able to compare apples to apples and what's going on with one country and what's coming up here. It talked about in the British schools that they actually go through an inspection periodically, and part of that inspection is not just quantitative, but it's also qualitative. The test that they go through in that evaluation is more on a holistic approach. And then the final points is where we end, and it said that with the passage of No Child Left Behind, it has become crucial. Standards-based accountability is not going to vanish in the foreseeable future, but it is going to change. So we really just need to try to be a product of that change and try to figure out what ways that we can support change. And that's all I have for that chapter.
Good deal. And just an aside, I think No Child Left Behind, if we were going to get rid of it, we would have gotten rid of it during the Obama years when the Democrats were in power. The No Child Left Behind came about through consensus between the Democrats and the Republicans. So I think what you'll see is some modifications from it, but I do believe No Child Left Behind will be around, or some modification for it sometime. All right. We are at 8:35, so we're going to stop. Now, Frida, did I ask you to present tonight? Because I'm going to ask you to move it back. Can you move it back
No,
next?
you did not. You asked for next Wednesday. Or do you want the following Wednesday?
Next Wednesday will work for me. And I have a second assignment for you. I'll send you an email, but maybe you and I can talk about that. All right, in wrapping up, excuse me. Did somebody ask me something?
No, I just said, okay.
All right, thanks, Frida. All right, in wrapping up, next week we have Frida's going to do North Carolina financial trends, and then we're going to have the Essex, beginning of Essex, which I think you will enjoy more because it deals with the law, which is something that you deal with on a daily basis. And our next meeting is on October the 3rd at 6 o'clock. And unless you all have something else to say, it's been a long night. I'll say good night to you. Everybody good?
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.
All right. Gotta stop recording.